What if fate plays with history? It was a rainy evening in London, 1895. The fog crept through the narrow cobblestone streets, like a living thing, swallowing the gas lamp's faint glow. Inspector James Carrington sat at his desk in Scotland Yard, tapping his fingers restlessly. Something was off tonight, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Just as he began to lose himself in his thoughts, the door creaked open, and an enigmatic figure stepped into the dim room. Cloaked in a long black coat and wearing a hat that shadowed their face, the person spoke softly. "Inspector Carrington, I have a proposition for you, a mystery that transcends time itself." The voice sent a shiver down his spine. "Who are you?" Carrington asked, squinting into the darkness. "My name is of little consequence, but you may call me Mr. Shade. I represent forces beyond your understanding, forces that influence fate itself." Carrington leaned back, unimpressed. "Fate? A bit dramatic, don't you think?" Mr. Shade smirked. "Duh. Have you ever wondered what would have happened if key historical figures had, tell me, Inspect, made different choices? What if Napoleon had never invaded Russia? What if Alexander the Great had lived to conquer further east? What if Caesar had never crossed the Rubicon?" Carrington's curiosity piqued, despite himself. "You're talking about alternate histories." "Precisely," Shade whispered. "And tonight, you'll have the chance to see how fragile history truly is. All it takes is one person, one decision, to alter the course of the world forever." Shade produced an ancient-looking device from beneath his cloak, a small, intricate hourglass with glowing sand. "This," he said, "is the chronoscope. With it, we can peek into the strands of history and pull at the threads of fate." Carrington's skepticism was melting into fascination. "And what do you propose we do?" "Join me," Shade said, "on a journey to witness moments where history hung in the balance. We shall see how different the world could have been." Without waiting for a response, Shade turned the hourglass, and the room dissolved into a swirl of light and shadow. When the spinning stopped, Carrington found himself standing in a vast, sunlit square, filled with the sounds of distant crowds and the clanging of armor. He recognized the scene immediately, the Roman Senate. "This is where Julius Caesar stands on the precipice of destiny," Shade whispered. "Today, he decides whether to cross the Rubicon, defying the Senate and starting a civil war." "But what if?" Shade flicked the hourglass, and time slowed. The familiar Caesar, the confident, ruthless general, paused in mid-stride. His face softened with doubt, and he turned back towards the Senate. The image blurred, and in its place, another reality unfolded. In this timeline, Caesar did not cross the Rubicon. He returned to Rome, brokered peace, and lived out his days as a respected statesman. The Roman Republic endured for centuries longer, and its influence stretched across the globe. Democracy, as we know it today, took root earlier, spreading stability across Europe and beyond. But it was not to last. Shade turned to Carrington. "See how a single choice reverberates through time. But it is not just Caesar. Every decision, large or small, shifts the currents of history." The hourglass turned again, and they were swept to a grand palace in France. Before them stood Napoleon Bonaparte, his hands hovering over a detailed map of Russia. It was 1812, and Napoleon was on the verge of his infamous invasion. But what if? Shade mused. He had listened to his advisors and delayed the campaign. The scene morphed, and in this alternate reality, Napoleon heeded the warnings. The invasion never happened. Instead, he consolidated power in Western Europe, ruling not with force, but with diplomacy. The wars ceased, and a united Europe emerged decades earlier. Without the trauma of Napoleon's destructive wars, the Industrial Revolution progressed faster, and by the 20th century, humanity had spread to the stars. Carrington was stunned. "Are you saying that all of this, everything we know, hinged on moments like these?" "Yes," Shade replied gravely. "But let us visit one more." They arrived in a small, nondescript study in a modest home. A young man sat at his desk, scribbling furiously. The walls were adorned with maps and diagrams, plans of conquest. The man's name was Adolf Hitler. "This is the moment where he decides to enter politics," Shade said, his voice cold. But what if just this once he had chosen a different path? With a final flick of the hourglass, Hitler stood up, abandoned his writing, and chose to pursue art. In this timeline, the man who would have brought untold destruction of Hitler rose to power. The world never saw the horrors of World War II. Millions lived who would have perished. The 20th century became one of peace, marked by technological advancement, not warfare. As the vision faded, Carrington found himself back in his office, the rain still pattering softly against the windows. Shade stood across from him, the hourglass safely tucked away. "You've seen it for yourself," Shade said. "History is not set in stone. Fate can play cruel tricks, but it is always shaped by the choices of individuals. One person can change everything." Carrington shook his head, trying to process what he had seen. "But why show me this? What am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" Shade smiled faintly. "Perhaps nothing. Perhaps something. The future is just as fragile as the past. Who knows what decisions you may make that could alter everything." With that, Mr. Shade turned and vanished into the misty night, leaving Carrington alone with his thoughts. He glanced at the small, dusty clock on his desk, its hands ticking forward, and wondered how many more unseen moments had already determined the fate of the world.